something to watch too. Their Stockton doesn't.
You got height.
Well,
Tracy, they estimate.
Oh,
From there.
Okay.
They will have 35,000 more jobs.
Do you have water?
And-
I do.
And then one thing
Yeah,
for,
companies like that, you know.
is be aware of the video.
Problem.
I mean, walking through is no big deal, but
Yeah.
So at what point do we actually,
I'm sure.
I'm not hitting the video here.
This
and I saw one
county,
up there.
you know,
oh, okay.
is growing.
Actually, here, Mark. Can I
But
just
we
take this
can't
one up
forget,
there?
you know, what our main industry is, which is out of that's really the number one.
Yeah.
That's,
Oh, there's this one.
of course, the airport by, could be there here, but I figured it would be a little, well, better than here.
Yeah.
Your district,
Something that's good.
We're not packing them in.
Unfortunately.
It's a smaller community.
Yeah.
So,
That's
yeah.
a good
very well.
question.
The market
What is the
is
industry?
performance all over the place. From the came from the south.
I'm Mark Miles. Ed Wanky.
What's the gym?
So are you
Did my shoe shine?
interested in the industry? Are you?
I'm the Zamfara County Economic Development.
Oh, okay.
So I'm
Yeah, they're
basically trying to get some information,
private
obviously.
sector as well.
This is the place for
It does.
You will leave here
Yeah.
saturated.
Just-
Oh, okay.
I facilitate.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but definitely.
Let's turn it over to Stacy. Stacy is part of
Oh, yeah.
So,
All
Watch my hair and everything.
wow.
I know you don't have water and
So we've tried college students and stuff of each other, so I'm like, what?
You know,
Does anybody smell like? Absolutely.
he's really grown. He's
Absolutely.
So, and I put together all the speaker notes, I guess that's agenda for this.
Oh,
There it is.
no.
Who told him this? And he's right. Yeah.
Doesn't
He's got good common sense.
It's at 9.
I really enjoy it.
I don't think that's a board meeting.
Oh, yeah, so big city.
Yeah, it's a Thursday.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got a,
Oh, he's here. Yeah, he's here, right, he lives right next to,
we might be able to do something. I can ditch a couple meetings that morning. We might be able to set something up.
Special class, yeah, you pay for it.
Our staff says that, I'll still
So we
pay
can
us
check
for
the
it.
calendar.
No, I'm not ready for that.
contracts.
It wasn't there. Check on
No,
But wait until you see the presentation. After you see it, you may say, yeah.
That's exactly why I'm here. I just want to line this all up and that's
Whatever. That was like, oh, like-
He's growing.
And then the music, it was like it had such
They're good attorneys. And we have a lot of good attorneys.
But I'm definitely, I just never said it on my feet, right? Yeah, it was like an extra $100 or something. I'm cool.
Oh, where's that?
I don't know, I started to explain she's just like, yeah, it's just, a lot of us are not gonna pay for it. You just give
May
it
11th.
for 8 monitors.
May
You
11th.
have to app it yourself.
Oh, really? How does that
Operate that on the back.
I don't know, I haven't downloaded the app, but it's like, it tracks all of the heart rate,
I think that's
all the
all
data.
Come on, man, check your calendar. My calendar, I have things that can change.
Same.
So what's your role?
Yeah. It was just fun to try it.
And that's like city.
Cities, counties, everybody who's interested, our chambers.
So, cool.
One of the instructors was kind of funny though. So I found the first night for that virtual reality one. And it was Matt.
We made.
Okay, but then
That'd be okay.
Yeah, okay, perfect.
That was last week. And then I came on the Monday afternoon, lunchtime line. He was an instructor there. It was just like after classes, getting the bikes, like white and the bike. Just like, alright. And then I came to like Matt's on Thursday. I know they would come in 2 of them. But she was thinking I was going to come back to Matt's. Like, we had a whole between classes. I was like, oh. But I didn't even think about it until after I'd walked in. I was just like, oh, my schedule's weird this week. So I have to do lunchtime. I'm definitely not that into just hurting when your class didn't want to come. Both of them.
I know, right?
Twice.
Seriously.
Yep, exactly. Exactly. Because that one that I went to this 4 weeks of free, this was the last 3 weeks. Week 2 is the virtual reality one. And then the third week, which was last week, that one was just like, it wasn't even that exciting. It just has the big screen and it just shows you like all of like of like where your heart rate
Okay,
is now,
ooh,
like how your heart
that's
rate
kind of
jumps throughout, like matching with music.
overpowering for this room and this crowd.
It's not that cool to me. Yeah.
Fly me to the, no, that's a different meeting, sorry. Well, thanks for coming out. This is the this is a public workshop for the San Joaquin County Cannabis Policy Project. I'm Mark Miles, I'm the County Counsel, and I'm going to do a bit of an introduction and the first part sort of lay the history that brings us to why we're here this evening. And then I'm going to turn it over to my partner in this project and really the brains and heart and soul behind it, Zoe Merrill, and she will take you through all of the different license types. All of the different license types, a discussion of the different license types, and a discussion to try and draw out from all of you your thoughts about the role of cannabis in the unincorporated county. And because we're attorneys and we don't do public outreach like this, we have a great team that's assisting us. We recently, the county adopted the general plan, and the land use planning firm of Mintier Harnish helped shepherd the county through, I think, an 8-year process for adoption of the general plan, and they did a fabulous job with community outreach. And so we asked them to come back and to help us with the public outreach for this project as well. And so we have Bob Lago Marcino, and he's going to be handing the mics. He won't let you take it out of his hand, but he'll hold it for you to speak. Well, maybe.
Okay, I won't.
Okay. And then we've got Jeffrey Graham. Jeff also has a microphone for this side of the room, because there's so many of you. And then Renee Funston, and Renee's job is critical because her job is to document all of the comments that we receive. And so we're recording it, we're streaming it live on Facebook, and then we're also recording the comments in a written form. And then our goal is to take all that information, we're going to hold a bunch of these meetings, and then bring it back to the board, compile it and bring it back to the board. We also, a big thanks to the county's Information Services Division, Systems Division. We've got Greg, and the rest of his team just walked out. Greg and Robert and Beth have been instrumental. They set up the sound for us, they set up the broadcast for us, and without them, this would be a big flop. So, a thank you to all of the team for the assistance that they provide us. So these are the things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about an overview of the state laws and the county ordinances that currently exist. We will talk about an overview of commercial cannabis business types and the way we break out those types is as follows. There are commercial cultivation types, there are retail dispensary types, there's manufacturing, testing, distribution, and transportation. And we group those together because they're really the non-public businesses. And we see them connected in that manner. And then lastly, we'll talk about personal cannabis cultivation. Workshop etiquette. Now this has to be a safe place where everybody can share their opinions without being criticized. Howard. Zach. So, not yet, not yet, but I hope you will. I hope you have a lot of information for us. But we want to stay on topic because we do want to be able to get out of here on time. Don't interrupt each other and be courteous. And so far we've had fantastic meetings and fantastic participation, and I think that will continue. feel free to ask questions at any point throughout I see this more as a conversation, as a dialogue, and not as just one of us up here presenting information. It is being live streamed on Facebook Live. We also have comment cards, so if there's additional information that you didn't get to share with us, you can fill out a comment card. There's a box in the back that you can drop the comment cards in, or you can leave them on the seat and we'll collect them at the end of the evening. So this is what we're doing. This is a schedule of the public workshops. Tonight we're in Ripon. Last night we were in Manteca. I feel like a band. Next week we'll be in Des Moines. Next week Monday we'll be at the University of Pacific. Tuesday we'll be in Lodi. And then on May 9th we'll be at the Elks Lodge. And then we've got 3 industry-specific meetings for those folks who are in the industry or think they want to be in the industry. A separate meeting for dispensaries and cultivation, and then a 3rd meeting for testing, transportation, distribution, and marketing. In addition to those, we've also had meetings and been requested by the members of the Board of Supervisors to meet with other interest groups within the county. We've met with the Ag Commission, the Farm Bureau. We have scheduled to meet with the Department of Education, the Office of Education. We've been asked to meet with the Medical Board, and so that's being set up. And so we're also throughout the county, we're having these separate discussions as well and presentations. So where are we at and why are we here? 2015, the state passed the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act, MRSA, and really what that did was set up a medical cannabis licensing scheme. And it set some ground rules for where dispensaries could be located and where cultivation could occur and some restrictions. And that finally brought some formal regulation to the medical cannabis industry that hadn't existed to date. And then that was followed in 2016 by the adoption of Prop 64. It passed in the county on a measure 51 to 49% vote. So it was close, but it did still pass statewide, passed in the county. And what that did was set up and legalized cannabis use for adult use, 21 and over. And it also set up licensing schemes for cannabis businesses or commercial cannabis operations, similar to what had previously been set up in the medical marijuana regulations. In what we're talking about is not how medical marijuana or commercial cannabis is going to play out in Stockton or Lodi or Ripon or Manteca or any of the incorporated cities. Instead, what we're talking about is what is the role going to be and what's the information going to go back to the board with regard to the unincorporated county. The current state law for medical and adult use, no public consumption, no smoking or vaping where tobacco is prohibited, no use, possession, or entry by anyone under 21, no cultivation or businesses within 600 feet of a school, no smoking within 1,000 feet of a school, except within a private residence, no possession on school or daycare property, no driving while intoxicated, no smoking in a vehicle, no unsecured outdoor cultivation, and no unsecured inventory. What it does say, though, is that you as an adult, 21 or over, may possess up to an ounce, you may consume it, you may grow 6 plants, and you can have the byproduct from those 6 plants. In 2008, I think it was, the county adopted a dispensary ban. And that was, if you think back in time, that was when the dispensaries were really starting to get going. Stockton was addressing the issue, and they were licensing some dispensaries. And the discussion at the Board of Supervisors at that time was not, we don't want anything to do with medical marijuana, or we have a problem with it, but it was more of a good government decision. what the county said from the dais was, we don't want, some cities are going to say yes, some cities are going to say no. We don't want somebody to go in the county right up on the city limit for a city that said no and be able to open their operation there and have those external factors pour over into that city. So we're going to say no as a county and let the cities do whatever it is that they see appropriate for their population. And then 3 years ago, the county adopted a cultivation ban which prohibits all indoor and outdoor medical marijuana cultivation in the county. So that sort of sets the groundwork for where we are today. In February, the end of February, Ms. Merrill brought a report to the Board of Supervisors to let the board know what the landscape was for medical marijuana and for cannabis after the passage of Prop 64, so that the board could give us direction on what they wanted us to do. And the board told us to do two things. First, the board said, take those two existing ordinances and we want you to go back and modify those to make sure that they prohibit all of the existing 19 license types. And also put in a sunset date. So we're going to prohibit all the license types, but a sunset date of December 31st of this year. So Miles, Merrill, y'all get on it. And step two was go out and talk to the public and get some input. What does the public think the role of cannabis should be in San Joaquin County? So talk to the public, also gather financial information about what the costs are if the county does nothing. What the risk-benefit analysis is if the county licenses cultivation or if the county licenses dispensaries or any of the other benefit types. Bring all of that information back to us and we'll provide you direction. So we're right now in the public outreach portion. What my goal is in order to satisfy the board's directive that we have these updated ordinances, those are going to go to the board in May for adoption. In order for the board to make a decision and for us to be able to carry out that policy before the end of the year, my goal is to bring all of the public information back to the board we're going to close off the public gathering by the 4th of July. We're going to consolidate all of that information and we're going to bring it to a report to the board on August 8th. And then at that time the board will give us direction on what it is they want to do. Do they want to license some business types in the unincorporated county? Do they not want to? And if they say license some, then we'll have time to put the proper ordinances and tax structures in place so that we can bring those back to the board by November so the board can adopt them or not. So that's kind of a timeline for where we're at and where we're going. The questions that we're asking are this: what types of cannabis businesses, if any, should be allowed in the county? What's the best location for each type of cannabis business? How and when should cannabis businesses be allowed to operate? And lastly, should the county impose reasonable regulations on the personal cultivation of cannabis? So those are the four questions that we're going to ask throughout this process. Reasonably regulate deals with topics of protection of public health, safety, and welfare. So the statutes allow that the county can reasonably regulate personal cannabis. So when we're talking about reasonably regulating, we're talking about how do we address these businesses so that they don't impose problems in their community, so they don't impose problems on their neighbors. And we're looking for feedback from the public, and we'll also be looking for feedback from the industry experts when we get to those meetings on the types of problems they've seen in other jurisdictions and how they've solved those problems there, if they've been able to. Personal cultivation, the county cannot ban the cultivation of 6 plants. However, the county can reasonably regulate it. And one of the questions that we're asking there is indoors or out. We can't prohibit indoor cultivation. We can allow outdoor cultivation. On commercial cannabis, the county may allow or may prohibit commercial cannabis businesses, and if they allow them, then we can reasonably regulate those as well. Some of the things that are developing in the state standards, distances from schools and daycares, we've already spoken about that. Health and safety and testing. The state is putting together their regulations right now, and they're going to address, for the commercial businesses, the types of pesticides that can be used, the types of herbicides that can be used, and when they can be used in relationship to harvest, and all those things that go into agriculture. Probably not a role for the county to set out rules in that regard, because they're very specialized. It may be a role for enforcement, though, for the Ag Commissioner. Environmental protections, worker protections, and security are things that we continue to hear about that are important to the communities. Actions the board can take, they can ban it in all of the zones, they can allow it or restrict it in certain zoning areas, ag zones, commercial zones, industrial zones. In overlay zones, a portion of the ag or a portion of the industrial zone with certain setbacks or buffers built into it. And additionally, the board can opt to allow businesses only subject to a use permit or a discretionary permit. A list of the zones that exist in the county: ag zones, residential zones, commercial and industrial. That brings us to the license types. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Merrill, and she'll do that presentation.
Good evening. Our goal in these is to have more public than team members. I'm not quite there tonight, but that is our goal. We're going to keep aiming for that goal. So share how great this is with your friends and your family. All right. So when we are talking about commercial cannabis business, partly why we made sure Mark went through the reasonable regulation language and why we're going to make sure as we go through each license type that we are taking the time to say this is how the state has defined this business. It's because when we get your input, we want to make sure we're all using the same language. We want to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing so that that input is really meaningful. When we compile all of it, we're able to speak in the same language, report that to the board, and they're able to make a really truly informed decision based on what their stakeholders have brought forward within the policy project. So we really appreciate you being here and hope we get a lot of feedback both tonight and on the website and from the friends you're going to send to the next meeting. All right. So when we talk about commercial cannabis business, most of us have been exposed to dispensaries in the collective cooperative models. Those have existed for quite a long time. We are now in a whole new world, so we're no longer in this collective cooperative small dispensary model, and instead what the state has defined and described and laid out in state law is a medical scheme, which is on the left side. This is under what Mark described, MCRSA. We're just going to refer to that as kind of the medical side of the cannabis business. And then we've got the adult license types, and that's for the folks over 21 who are not medical patients, but instead are going to use it recreationally within state and local guidelines. This is a complicated structure. Certainly for regulation, it is laid out with an incredible amount of detail, and so if it looks complicated to you, yes, I will answer that question. It is complicated from a regulatory standpoint. But it's not complicated from a discussion standpoint, because what we've done is we've said, look, cultivation types 1 through 4 on the medical side and 1 through 5 on the adult side, those are, in essence, we're able to talk about those using the questions of cultivation. So we're going to look at all those license types 1 through 5 as cultivation, and we're going to break it down that way. We're going to look at this yellow, kind of orangey color, dispensaries and retail, as being a commercial operation, a store. And so we're going to break down those license types and talk about them that way. And then we're going to group together types 6 through 12 there on the medical side and 6 through 12 on the adult side as being the logistic license types. So we're going to cover 3 general areas both in tonight's discussion when we take the information forward to the board in August, and ultimately when we're using language in policy drafting, we expect to kind of see that same grouping. All right, so as I said, we've got 17 license types or business types. Those are types of business. So when I use those are essentially interchangeable in the medical side, and 19 on the over 21 recreational or adult side. Like I said, we're looking at cultivation business types. Manufacturing is a business type. Testing, distribution, and transport. And then of course retail and dispensaries, what we're all pretty familiar with. When we look at the state law and how it is laid out, what it describes and defines as now the commercial cannabis market, this is what it's talking about. This is the product movement within commercial cannabis, and anything outside of this structure, outside of this licensed and regulated movement is illicit, unless it is the personal cultivation of those 6 plants currently indoor. And so you can see actually prior to the cultivator, there's a nursery business type. That's part of the cultivation. From the cultivator, there's some processing that happens there, but then if it's going to be used in an edible or some other non-traditional plant form, it's going to go to the manufacturer. It's going to go to the distributor using a licensed transport, which you can see there with the green blob, which is a blob of truck. That's a truck blob. And from the distributor, it's going to have to go to and from the testing lab. Again, we've got a track and trace system that's going to track and trace the product through this sort of series of events, but it's got to then go back to the distributor, and only from the distributor can it then ultimately end up with the medical patient or the adult consumer there to dispensary or retail. So as we talk about these license types, I want you to understand that they're interrelated, and really each step is required for that product to legally and safely get from the nursery cultivator ultimately to the consumer. So the first topic we're going to talk about, just this little no big topic of cannabis cultivation. Super complicated, obviously really impactful on a community, and so this is the biggest topic. We could spend all night on it. Well, maybe not with this small of a crowd, but theoretically one could spend all night on cultivation. But instead we're going to break it down and really focus on the fact that under medical and adult use cultivation, despite the fact that there are multiple business types, right? There's 5 on the medical side, 4 on the adult side. But it really comes down to, when we're looking at what's right for our community, in this case District 4, do we think it is best to have that cultivation indoor? Do we think it's best, can we protect health and safety as well as allow businesses to thrive if they are allowed by having it outdoor? Or instead, do we want to see it in a mixed light business type? And what that is greenhouses, or alternatively a traditional type of row growing but with a hoop structure or greenhouse over it. So when we look at medical and adult use in our discussion, we really want to talk about indoor, outdoor, and mixed light, not necessarily types 1 through 5 or 1 through 4. So the state law, and Mark talked about this and I talked about this, the state law has laid out both the definitions and then started down the regulatory path within the legislation itself, and will ultimately propound even more detailed regulation. But the state law is written right now, says if you're going to have a cannabis business, you cannot have it within 600 feet of a school site. When we look at District 4, and it wraps around here, these are the school sites that exist in District 4. So anywhere within that kind of golden circle, or yellow circle, that cannot be a commercial cannabis business under state law, period. We cannot change that, that's in state law. So 600 feet of schools as well as a 1,000-foot buffer for other activities are protected. So if part of the community is worrying when I go to drop off Bobby at the kindergarten, am I gonna be looking at a dispensary? No, you're not. The legislature says that that's not acceptable, and so we want people to understand what that looks like in your district, District 4. Also, we're talking about cultivation. So when we talk about cultivation, most people think it's been defined as an agricultural product under state law. When we think of agricultural products, we think of agriculture. We think of agriculture, we think of the agricultural zone, or at least that's what lawyers do. If nobody else does that, that might just be us. So if it's to be in the agricultural zone, if you think of cultivation as being an agricultural product that belongs in the agricultural zone, in District 4, these areas in green, which totally match my skirt, are where they can be located. So I want you to have that visual, because remember, we have the threshold question of, do we in District 4 think we should have cannabis businesses? Of those types of businesses, do we think cultivation is a type of business that's right for our community? And if we think about where, this may be one of those options. Where is the agricultural zone where we want to see it? Alternatively, maybe somebody says, hey, the ag zone is for our existing ag community, which is thriving. It's a huge part of San Joaquin County, and therefore, Zoe, you're crazy. The ag zone is not where it belongs. Instead, I want to see indoor cultivation, and I think that is more appropriate in a commercial zone. If that's what you're thinking as appropriate for cultivation, then I want to make sure visually you understand where the commercial zones are in District 4. So represented in red are the commercial zones throughout District 4. They are tiny. This PowerPoint, though, is posted onto sjccannabis.org, where the workshop meeting date was. Both the video of tonight's presentation as well as the PowerPoint are available, will be available. And so this map will be there. Also, if you have specific mapping questions, we can really help you and say, okay, that little red dot, here's a closer up. So we just want to get a visual tonight, so we're talking about the same thing. Now, we have ag is an option for cultivation. Commercial may be an option for cultivation, but there's another place where large industrial, like a large warehouse for indoor cultivation, or potentially even a greenhouse structure could exist, and that's the industrial zone. So in District 4, here's where our industrial zones are. Certainly nothing compares to ag, but ag is going to take up, if you're opting for an outdoor, it's going to take up a much larger area than an indoor grow, and so these are industrial potential option sites for cultivation. So again, we've got the threshold question of, do we want to see commercial cannabis in our community? And then the second question of, where is that appropriate if we opt to have those? So when we think about, do we want them in our community, we always have to ask ourselves, what are the ways that this would affect the neighbors? We often use in this presentation the idea that when a property use is allowed, we have to consider how that use affects the neighboring parcel. Does my use bleed over the edge of my parcel into the rights of the next parcel over, into the quality of life of a neighbor or somebody else utilizing their property and being in that space? And so when we consider whether something is appropriate for our community, these are what we're talking about. Is odor going to be an issue that affects other people? Is security going to be an issue that ultimately creates a health and safety situation? Water use. San Joaquin County is, water is incredibly important to our county, and it will continue to be a growing issue. So is there a way here that if we allow it, that we somehow mitigate our water needs, or is the use such that it's not appropriate? That's kind of some of the questions. Energy use, very similar. Building code and safety issues. Businesses are always subject to existing laws, but are there unique issues that come with either indoor cultivation or a greenhouse structure? Costs, available location, that's kind of the zone discussion. Buffer zones, because land use inevitably is about the interaction between two parcels, do we see it needing to be internalized into the center of a parcel? County fees, and then enforcement. A regulation is only as good as the enforcement. If we have something and we allow something and we're unable to enforce the rule, then we essentially have what we have now, right? An unregulated market. So enforcement is always a question when we're thinking about how something would affect our community. These are the community considerations we are talking about. And don't worry, because you'll see the slide again. All right, so just again, visually, some options for if we allow them, where is it appropriate to have those commercial businesses located, and in this case, cultivation. Any questions on cultivation? We're going to open the discussion in just a minute, but are there any just questions? Like, Zoe, what the heck is it?
I have a general question, Zoe, and it's
Okay.
not limited to cultivation.
Because I like you, I'm going to let you go ahead and ask it.
Is county staff giving any consideration to the feasibility of having a location with an industrial park and having all of the potential uses potentially inside in that park, in those facilities which are large enough to do all of it, including security, staffing, distribution, and whatever, as opposed to just isolating cultivation in one place, distribution in another, and dispensary somewhere else?
It's a great question. So the way that the Cannabis Policy Project is structured is we're at the phase where we're really taking information in, but that has been raised at workshops and then separately. And it's one of those, really, it's a creative option. It is an option that's been raised as being much more economically feasible for businesses and addressing some of these community concerns. And so that information has definitely been taken into the project, is being digested, and is definitely on the table. What he's talking about, for the large crowd that may not be familiar with what Howard has raised, is that when we talk about these, he's right, we're isolating each business type, and the way the language is structured is as if there will only be a cultivation and there will be a conditional use permit for only this type and that type. Alternatively though, if you could have a large structure, either existing infrastructure which has been raised, or alternatively an industrial zone where you're able to have those license types served, and whether there's a public aspect of that or not would have to be addressed. But I think that looks a little bit like the Ghirardelli ice cream place where we've got a public access but a large structure which potentially houses manufacturing or distribution or transportation. And yes, so it is on the table for sure. We've had some really creative things that we would not have considered necessarily, but are being brought to the table. Any other questions on cultivation? I know, you're like, you grow something, no big deal. Okay. All right, so now we're gonna get to the discussion. And the reason that we have laid this out is because what we want to do is make sure people are really, really thinking about it, because we want to get as much information as possible. So like I've been referring to, there's a threshold question here, and that's, should the county permit commercial cannabis cultivation? If the answer is no, the discussion stops there. But if the answer is yes, then we go on to say, okay, well how? What does that look like in District 4? Should the county permit outdoor cultivation? What are the cost benefits of it? Should we only consider indoor cultivation, and we should consider indoor cultivation? Or is mixed light the most appropriate because it's going to balance the issues? That's the question. So if, then how? And should the county permit nurseries? That's a non-public business type, meaning the public can't go and buy those. They're the equivalent of like a wholesale nursery, where only a licensed cultivator could come and get that product. It's a key part of the product movement and getting that ultimate product to the user, but is it what we want to see in our community? And then once we get sort of through those questions, what's the appropriate way to grow it if we're going to allow it to be grown here, is should medical cultivation be treated differently from adult use? Before November of 2017, recreational was not an option. That was illicit, period. And so that is a totally new question, right? It never had to be asked before. But now, if we're going to allow those businesses, do we value the medical market in a different way than the recreational market? And then where, if anywhere, should commercial cannabis cultivation be permitted? That goes back to our question of zone, right? So we maybe think indoor is the best way to allow the business here, but to limit the health and safety aspects, and therefore, where do we want to see that? So those are the discussion parameters, but believe me, go beyond that. This is just a starting point. So we're going to go ahead and open up that discussion. Ready to go. We've got Bob with a mic, and I think Jeffrey also has a mic. And I think he is going to let you hold it since it's a pretty small crowd.
Thanks, Bob. Just this one.
Just this once.
Good evening, Zoe.
Hi, Zach.
I think the county definitely should allow outdoor, indoor, and mixed light cultivation as well as nurseries. As it relates to mixed light and outdoor cultivation, I think it should be restricted to the agricultural zone predominantly. For indoor cultivation, I don't think there's any reason to restrict it from the agricultural zone, especially if there is existing infrastructure that can be developed for indoor cultivation. I'd like to just draw an example from another county that has chosen to undertake a regulatory program on their own, and that's Calaveras County. They're a county that was heavily impacted by mixed light outdoor growers mostly, and where they were a county that lacked the resources to actually go out and draw a distinguishing line between legitimate operations and illegitimate operations. Putting their urgency ordinance on the books allowed about 740 cultivators to pay $5,000 apiece to their county, placing $3.7 million into their county coffers, allowing the county to purchase the equipment, hire the sheriff's deputies and code enforcement officers to actually go out and administer their regulatory program. In addition to that, UOP's Eberhart School of Business recently conducted a study on the economic impact of the cannabis industry in Calaveras County. And what they found was that in 2016, the cannabis industry in Calaveras County generated about $339.2 million in revenue. It supported about 3,400 jobs and drove about $172 million in labor income. It was by far their largest industry. I think we do have the agricultural infrastructure here and substantial interest that we can see that type of investment. And given the fact that cannabis currently is valued at $2.7 to $4 billion in the state of California and anticipated to grow to between $9 and $15 billion in the next 5 to 10 years, our participation in this industry can be an extremely important part of our economy. And I think if we were to allow this opportunity to pass us up, we would regret it down the line. Should there be a difference as far as the regulation of medical cannabis businesses and adult use cannabis businesses? As far as the county is concerned, I don't think it should be our prerogative to determine which types of state licenses the local operators apply for. I think ultimately the adult use market will carry the day. The governor has recently submitted, I think it's a bill rider to try and reconcile the differences between AUMA and MCRSA. The state has yet to resolve those conflicts. I think administering our regulatory program with one set of licenses for each license type would be the most prudent way to institute our regulations, at least initially, until the state has the opportunity to fill out their substantive regulatory standards.
So we would say cultivation, define it in an equivalent way for MCRSA, sort of in the medical model and in the adult model, and that cultivator that would have a local approval for cultivation, and they would then seek to get a state license and ultimately be subject to the regulations for either adult use or medical.
Correct.
Okay. I have a follow-up question too, and I want to keep it open and I want to keep the conversation going, but on the economic data, the data that you cited, can you expand on whether your understanding of Calaveras, the cost of enforcement was actually recouped by the entity, or was that just the general business in Calaveras County? Because a lot of what we hear is that ultimately for the entity itself, that the general fund is depleted more than it's actually provided for, which means that the taxpayers are not necessarily getting the benefit, even though there may be certain businesses or certain segments of the population that are benefiting. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, and I think the issue there is that from the time that the urgency ordinance was established up until this point now, there was a political shift in the county where several of the supervisors that were in favor of regulating the commercial industry actually lost their seats. And now there's actually a majority in favor of the ban. In addition to that, some of the county departments there in Calaveras County are less than enthusiastic about the inundation from the new workload that they have in the process of administering the applications, going out and checking compliance according to their ordinance. And so they're getting some, I think they're having a difficulty now that there has been this political shift in getting staff to actually go out and administer the program.
So I think, because you did quote some economic benefits, but there's clearly been some bumps in that road.
Correct.
Correct, okay. Let's open it up to on cultivation. So I think we have some good notes from where Zach stands on cultivation. Any other thoughts on, again, indoor, outdoor, mixed light? If yes, where? If no, why? Do it.
I personally would.
Nope, get him a mic. Because Howard, what we want to do is make sure, remember, we're recording it. We're also putting it on Facebook, and because we're using these to compile reports for the board, we want to make sure we get your comments, Howard.
Well, I'm one that is generally supportive of the indoor cultivation, and one of the reasons is the elimination of adverse community impacts by having them outdoors in agricultural areas as opposed to allowing them in industrial or commercial areas with appropriate safeguards and infrastructure. And from what I have learned, it appears that if it is indoors and a large enough facility, it can appropriately address virtually all issues that would be of concern to the general public, as well as those that live in close proximity to the agricultural zones.
So those odors, security, some of those issues?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Anybody have any thoughts on that? He'll get his chance to weigh in.
I agree with Mr. Saligny that those security concerns do exist, and they're more prevalent with outdoor cultivation facilities. However, I do believe that they can be adequately addressed through regulation, such as setbacks from public thoroughfares, setbacks from adjacent properties, security measures such as fencing, surveillance cameras, security patrols, things like that could be implemented to adequately address the security concerns and some of the public safety and health issues that may arise.
Any other thoughts? There's only 3 people. I expect 3 comments on every, no.
I actually don't have a feeling one way or the other about allowing the cultivation of cannabis, but some thoughts I have as far as permitting outdoor cultivation. San Joaquin County is obviously historically and currently a very high agriculture, economically diverse and strong county. My concern permitting outdoor cultivation would be, will it offset other products because of the high profit of cannabis? One can assume that it's going to be high profit. That's why everyone is talking about this so much. But will it offset some of the other crops that we currently have historically that have done so well in the county? It'd be very easy to say, hey, well, we can make a lot more money growing pot than growing cherries, and it's a lot more consistently, the revenue is consistent, so let's do that. Indoor cultivation, again, it can almost be the same thing. It's highly profitable. I know of a number of people that have come into the area already that have offered owners of industry to essentially, hey, boot out, as soon as this becomes legal, boot out your current tenants, evict them, and we'll pay 5 times what they're paying to lease your property. So again, it's obviously very complicated, but those would be my concerns if it's permitted.
And by offset, I just want to clarify, so that's exactly what you mean. So instead of this 5 acres of cherries, I'm going to plant marijuana, and now we have less land in food or in wine, both of which are really important to San Joaquin County. Okay, and also if anybody wants to weigh in, I would love to follow up on that question of if you boot out your current tenants and put in cultivation, and I know you have an economic development background, and so is the thought there that do jobs go with that? Do we have a 1-to-1 job ratio? Is there a product that maybe we're selling and that has a benefit to the community? And by replacing that with cannabis, are we losing something, including jobs? Is that kind of where that comment was focused? Because I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, I think that absolutely. And the other thing you're doing is you're increasing the cost of doing business. You could be increasing the cost of doing business for other industries, because now all of a sudden you're driving the prices up for those facilities. For
increasing the value of either
Exactly.
renting that space or buying that space.
Exactly. So that's something I think that needs to be taken into account.
Right. No, those are really good comments, and we haven't had something that specific, and I think really adds a layer to the question of indoor cultivation that hasn't existed before. We've had some discussion about renewable energy in the indoor market, which often isn't part of the discussion, so that was a creative way to say, wait a minute, there may be a consideration there, but that is new, and so I think that's really important, and that's why we've got Renee taking really good notes. So thank you. Any other comments on cultivation? I'm not hearing a lot of medical and adult being separated, but instead it's really about those community considerations. Does that pretty much sum it up?
Really, when you talk about the medical versus the recreational, basically you're talking about the retail part of it, as to who can go into the dispensaries and purchase with either a medical card, or if a person is over 21, they can go in and buy. But that's a totally different issue, I think, than the issue of cultivation.
Good point. The state has outlined different standards for the medical and the adult use through the different business license types, but they are minimal, and you're right, we are not really getting information on these early business types about the difference, but some people have a very strong opinion, and so we just want to make sure putting that question out there. Some people value it as a medicine, but don't think we need necessarily to increase the rec market, so we're just trying to feel that out. But you have a good point, especially in the area of cultivation. From a regulatory standpoint, the community considerations aren't that different. All right, so now we are talking about exactly what you just raised, which is retail and dispensary. Remember, it's defined as retail under adult use and dispensary under medical, but it for all intents and purposes, it is a store where you can buy cannabis in various forms. And so it is very similar to existing dispensaries in that you go in and you can have various products. You get to choose those and you ultimately purchase them, whether you're doing that pursuant to a medical recommendation or because it's Friday and what the heck. Either way, they look about the same from a community standpoint. There are different state regulations, and unless and until the governor's trailer bill addresses it or some other legislative mechanism addresses it or regulation sufficiently addresses it, we do have some questions ultimately about whether they can co-locate, whether they can mix the products since the testing standards are different. But from a public policy, does this belong in my community standpoint, they're not that different. The question for us, our project is trying to get information on, is the county may allow or prohibit this type of cannabis business. We may allow or prohibit cannabis retail stores and dispensaries in the unincorporated county. The other question we can look at, the other direction the board can ultimately go, is those facilities, if they're allowed in District 4, allowed in the unincorporated county, should we allow mobile delivery services? So although it can exist on Main Street, well, not the incorporated Main Street, but so it exists on County Street 101, is it allowed from that location to deliver, into communities, deliver to somebody's house? That's a question we can allow or prohibit. Also, does that site, should we allow for on-site consumption, or should you have to go in, buy it, and leave? Or instead, can I go in and sit in the vape lounge and enjoy my 420 nug or whatever they call it, I don't know. And that may have totally different community concerns, right? So if I can vape on site, does that change the comings and goings? Does that change what that site brings to that corner, to that block? Or is it more like a CVS where people are just coming in and coming out? Those are some real questions we want to look at and get input on. So again, this is a map of the commercial zones. Now these are stores. This is a business. This is where I'm selling a product, and so the appropriate place for that type of business would be a commercial zone, and that's where we would see it located. So again, in red, you've got the parcels in District 4 that have commercial zoning. Community considerations. This is the same list. It's a very different business, right? So it has very different odor concerns, security concerns, but the list is the same. These are what we always consider. Water use, energy use, again, very different from cultivation, but always something we consider. And I want to bring your eyes down to that bottom line, enforcement. And that's because, again, a regulation is only as good as it can be enforced and only as good as we are able to enforce it, but also it has to allow a business to survive and to thrive. So we have to balance that out. All right, so any just questions on retail and dispensaries? These have been around a while. Howard? See, now we've got them warmed up.
You have a real serious social issue to consider, and that is the potential social impacts by combining a retail facility that services both the medical side as well as the adult side. Medical side can obviously, with a guardian or an adult, can provide cannabis to a minor. And my only concern would be what potential impact would occur in the event that you have mixed people coming into one dispensary that provides both medical and recreational. And how do you make sure that if you're on the medical side, that that's all it is? If you're on the recreational side, that's fine. But I think it raises serious social issues.
Okay, so we've moved to discussion, so what I want to do is do a follow-up with that, and then I want to frame the discussion, if there's no questions on dispensary and retail, but that goes back to that discussion, right, where we said the state has sort of bifurcated the definitions, including testing standards. So a medical product will have had a different testing level and sort of allowable amount of pesticide residue or fungus or whatever it's testing for, its THC level that's acceptable, its cannabinoid profile as being acceptable is different for the medical product. As we trace it through that product movement, it is actually a different product than the adult use, which is going to have different testing standards and therefore have to meet a different testing set of standards. Now, because those are different, if they are both sold in that market, they have to be sold separately. Is that just a point of sale difference, or socially as far as regulatory, do we want to say adult use can be in these zones or with this type of permit, alternatively medical would be in these areas or with this type of permit? Is that kind of where you're going, is that we should consider or need to consider those as being totally separately approved?
Or potentially having facilities that are specializing in one area, such as medical, as opposed to the retail. It doesn't have to be necessarily in different zones, but there needs to be some separation so that the county can have appropriate control. The person that receives the cannabis is getting what that person is entitled to under the statutes, whether it's medical or otherwise, and not putting staff or county enforcement officers in a position to determine whether or not there is such a mix that it impacts what they're supposed to do or not do.
Okay, an interesting point. So certainly that operator would be in violation of state law if they were not selling a medical product to a medical patient. On the other hand, are we as local operators setting up for failure? Could we not enforce that effectively? And so therefore do we? What is your thought? What is a good idea about a way to do that? Have you thought about that?
Slightly. But, you know, as a comparison, I look at code enforcement in the county. We obviously know that there's a great problem with code enforcement going wherever they go and having sufficient staff to go and make sure, or try and make sure that the codes are either being enforced or there's some ramifications of it. But when you get into the cannabis industry and you have an enforcement officer going in and seeing both sales of recreational as well as medical, I think you're putting your own county staff in a predicament that's will be hard to control.
Interesting. And so even though there has been some suggestion about doing a sort of general approval and sort of leaving that business, that creates both issues on the government side and our ability to enforce, and also maybe puts the public at risk. It's an interesting question. So at CVS, they have both a pharmacy and they have alcohol sales, but you're saying because these products are really so similar, it may really be difficult. It's different than putting a 6-pack on the counter and putting a bottle of pills on the counter. It's pretty easy to tell that one can go to somebody over 21 and one needs to go to this person. It's fundamentally different than that CVS model, and maybe we need to really address that. Interesting question. Okay, or interesting comments. So we're going to move this slide because we've moved on. Okay, so the discussion for cannabis retail and dispensary, which clearly we've started. On the other hand, I still think it's important to set up some framing for the discussion. We have the threshold question of should we allow it at all? And then that secondary question of should medical retail businesses be treated differently? So Howard sort of read our mind. I think he moved ahead. So any other comments on either Howard's comment or just in general? Zach?
I think the county should absolutely allow cannabis dispensaries and retail businesses, mostly in the commercial and industrial zones in the county. By allowing regulated retail dispensaries, you are providing safe access for the consumers, whether they be legitimate medical patients or recreational users. By regulating that business, you're ensuring that the individual consumer has access to safe, lab-tested, quality products that are going to be mandated to be labeled by the state. As far as distinguishing between the serving the recreational market and the medical market in one place or another, I think that comes back to the market that the individual operator chooses to serve. As it stands now, there are two separate regulatory structures, one for medical and one for recreational. the state actually has conferred discretion and authority unto law enforcement to send individuals into stores to conduct stings. So for instance, if you have an operator holding themselves out strictly as a medical operator, and you send a person in there without a medical recommendation, and they are provided cannabis, they're clearly in violation. On the contrary, if you allow an 18-year-old person to go into a recreational dispensary or a retail site, maybe they have a doctor's recommendation for cannabis. If that particular operator has chosen to serve only the recreational market and not the medical market, well, that 18-year-old with a rec, if he's provided cannabis, that's a violation. And so I think it comes down to diligent enforcement, and again, back to who the individual operators, which market they choose to serve, and which state license that they ultimately choose to apply for. As it stands now, given the federal issue, local operators will continue to operate as medical marijuana cooperatives, as mutual benefit nonprofit corporations, at least until the state provides further guidance on how they're going to reconcile those differences between the two regulatory structures, and until we get further indication on how the federal enforcement issue is going to shake out.
Well, those collective cooperatives under state law will have 1 year, and then they'll need to shift into getting that state license to be a dispensary or retail. But I want to go back a little bit. You're saying, so essentially law enforcement can come in, but Howard raised the issue of a lot of this might be code enforcement. So if we set regulations that say this is where you can be and this is the minimum standard and you have to have X and Y and Z safety controls, that's on our code enforcement, and that's a cost. So where do you see that cost coming from, or is that a cost our community pays?
Tax revenue.
From the cannabis market?
That's the only way that you draw the resources to actually go out and proactively regulate, is by regulating and taxing the operator.
So do you see those taxes as funding either a unique position or a group of officers who are specifically cannabis trained, so that our code enforcement that's existing, we're not utilizing that existing structure, but in fact funding an entirely new set of compliance officers, audit officers, code enforcement for cannabis?
Or designating existing employees to conduct those types of operations and conduct that type of code enforcement.
But it being paid for?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Any other thoughts on dispensaries retail? Certainly that medical adult use, both on the state level and on the local level, has to be addressed. That was a really interesting comment about the inability to tell the difference, which, you know, I tend to think of those if they were co-located like a CVS, but in fact, I, as a patient buying a medical, I can't necessarily see that. Even though it may be labeled from the testing facility, I may not be able to see that, and that may be a real risk. Interesting, okay. It has been raised in other workshops and in other venues to us that these dispensaries will have people coming in and out, and that may create either a security concern, people loitering in front. Will that bring, the block that it's located on, is that going to bring that block down? Any thoughts on that? I mean, this is the most public license type. This is the most public business.
Well, Stockton has at least one legal one, and there might be some illegal ones, but the one legal one is in a shopping center off of Wilson Way. And they have whatever security the city requires, the controls, and if it's done the way they're supposed to do, I don't see that as a problem.
Now, if it's done the way it's supposed to be done, is the assumption that it will be, or is the assumption that it won't be?
Well, the city, for example, has ordinances which indicates the type of lighting, the type of security you have to have, the type of staff you have to have, the type of enclosure, locking the facility, how many staff, how you control that. But I think that can be easily addressed in regulatory form and then implemented.
Okay. Go ahead.
I agree. I'll cite a study from the Journal of Alcohol and Drug Abuse, which cited that the density of medical marijuana dispensaries was not associated with property or crime rates, based on the same security standards that are required to be implemented at these facilities, which include on-site security staff, comprehensive surveillance coverage, an open door policy with 100% transparency to local law enforcement agencies, and the ability by virtue of holding on to a local license to operate to actually pick up the phone and contact law enforcement when you have a security issue, as opposed to, you know, operating discreetly under the former gray market model, where if you pick up the phone and call authorities, well, you're running the risk of some adverse scrutiny from law enforcement yourself. And so I think, you know, if you regulate these locations, you're going to require them to implement security standards. They may actually make the communities in which they're operating safer.
Okay. And interesting that we've got a local, at least within the county, even though it's in the incorporated area, and you're not seeing those effects. And there's some good options. Okay. Any other thoughts on dispensary and retail? Because he knew I was going to make him say something.
The only question I have is what's happened in the communities that have gone through this already? Is it Colorado and Washington? What effects have they seen?
So there's a lot of data coming in from Colorado and Washington, and I think a lot of it is spun one way or the other, and so I think whoever you ask could cite to you a statistic that said everything is perfect in Colorado, and you know, somebody over here is going to say, you know, every child under 10 is, you know, smoking marijuana. I mean, there's a lot of data out there. From what I have read, do not believe there have been, you know, significant adverse impacts. I think it's very difficult to measure some of those things. One of the things we'll be bringing to the board are cost-benefit analysis from experts who are looking at those markets, as well as looking at cities and counties within the state who have brought in either cultivation or dispensaries or different models and saying, here's the cost-benefit. And that cost, when we say cost, that includes increase of law enforcement responses. You know, did they have to have code, you know, did they have to bring on 3 staff people? So that cost benefit is not a pie in the sky sort of, you know, the big operators are making millions of dollars. Instead, it's really a cost benefit to the entity. So that's part of what will be brought to the board. It is a pretty slippery set of data at this point.
I'll cite the Department of Justice.
Except to Zach, it's not. He's got this.
Based on one of the studies that I've read, according to the FBI, between 2012 and 2015, property and violent crime rates in the state of Washington have actually decreased. And that time period is from the time that recreational use was legalized in the state of Washington up until those data and statistics was collected in probably early 2016.
I think one thing that's interesting, and you know, we had sort of talked about, you know, do we bring up the situation in Sacramento? Do we lay that out as a question? And I don't want to see that laid out as a question. But one thing that Zach is bringing up is that if you have property crime going down, that may be the result of there is no longer the house in the tract, you know, being taken over as an illicit grow house, because instead we're pulling the market away from buying from the guy in the corner who needs the illicit grow house, and instead bringing it into a regulated market. And because we'll have large-scale indoor or outdoor or mixed light cultivation, there's a system within which I can buy that, a regulated marketplace. So ideally what we're doing is we're drawing the buyers, the consumers away from the black market, and we would have less grow houses, less you know, crime, less property crimes as well as violent crimes where those are being taken over. There's less funding of gangs. So I think, you know, anecdotally we sort of understand that model, but again, depending on who you ask, there are different things cited. Ideally, at least with I do want to just touch on one more thing, then we're going to move on, but that's that the state has sort of taken the position that we're legalizing it, we're creating a regulated market, and our vision at the state level has been communicated to be, we expect to see the black market ultimately go down, the way that they did post-prohibition. There are definitely different schools of thought on that. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to move on to what we call the logistic license types, the businesses that are moving that product around. What we're going to do is go through manufacturing, testing, distribution, and transportation. It takes less time than one would think. And what we'll do is we'll ask questions on each license type, and then we're going to discuss them together. Because they have really similar community considerations, very different than distribution, or very different than dispensaries and cultivation. So first, manufacturing. So as the state defines manufacturing, they actually include the preparation of cannabis for sale, and these are the items that they define. Now, some of these actually are going to happen, and I learned this at one of our workshops actually. Some of these are actually happening at the cultivation site, and then they're transporting that product for other steps of drying, cleaning, curing, packaging, and then this is what's really key is extraction of the ingredients. So they're going to take that plant product, utilize solvents, either non-volatile or volatile, in order to pull from that plant the oils, the THC, the cannabinoids that they'll ultimately put into other products, whether that be soda, yeah, that's a thing, you know, creams, edibles. This is where your brownie comes from, folks. So the reason that we include this is not because we want people to understand that there's danger, there's not, but so that you truly understand what they're doing, that they are truly a functioning manufacturing facility. I have been using a Frito-Lay analogy, but I have been advised that a better analogy is almond milk. So you're going to take an ag product and you're going to transport it into the facility. That ag product, which is, you know, perishable and is coming from these trucks, is then processed to pull out of that product something that's then ultimately used as an ingredient in a product. That product is right there on site, packaged, and then sent through that product movement market ultimately to get to that dispensary for the end user. All right, so because it is industrial manufacturing, the only appropriate place is really in an industrial zone. There are different sub-industrial zones, but generally these are the areas that industrial zones exist in District 4, and so these are the places where a manufacturing license, manufacturing business would be appropriate. So we just want you to have a visual of that. These are the community considerations. I think they are seriously diminished, at least as to odor on something like the manufacturing, and to some extent security, because the products within which are probably less usable than either a cultivation site or a dispensary. But we do always have these other community considerations. Now, any questions on the manufacturing business type? Okay, so what we're going to do is, like I said, we'll go through each of the logistic license types, we'll ask a question, and then we'll do a discussion at the end. All right, the next one is testing. We've actually talked more about testing tonight leading up to this than we usually do, but I want you to understand what this looks like if you're going to answer the question and have a discussion on whether you want it in your community. So a testing business, these have been extensively defined within state law, but there are not regulations yet, and so this is really going to be shaped, and ultimately people will make the decision on whether it's, you know, a business they want to go into as the regulations come down. This business is going to test all the cannabis, so it's going to come in from the cultivator or the manufacturer, depending on what form it's in, and this testing facility will test it and ultimately certify for resale or transfer prior to delivery to dispensaries or other businesses. The things that they're testing for, as example, cannabinoids, that is one of the key ingredients for the medical market, but also important to know in the rec field, contaminants, microbiological impurities, and other compounds spelled out in state law. This is a very complicated structure, and this is what Mark was referring to, that the regulations in state law, those set the standard. We can't, they set a minimum standard. We probably could allow something beyond that, or allow another additional test if we found that to be key to the health and safety of our community. But that's probably beyond what we want to see doing, and I don't expect that really to be something we're looking at. So what we are just looking at is whether a testing business is appropriate in our community. And it doesn't have the same implications as cultivation or dispensaries, but it is a cannabis business, and so we have had people say, cannabis is cannabis, and therefore. And so as we get into the discussion, I want you to think about that. Any questions on the testing business? Okay. Because we have a pretty small crowd, and you're not too rowdy, we're going through these pretty quickly, so definitely feel free to jump in and say, Zoe, slow down, or I have a question. And we have cookies in the back, just so you know.
What's in the cookies?
Chocolate chips. And I have never said chocolate chips in a disappointed way, but this time I am. All right, the next logistic business type, so one that really the public cannot go to and purchase cannabis, or it's not sold to the public, is a distribution license. So again, we think about that product movement slide, and what a distribution facility is going to be doing is going to be regulating the flow between other cannabis businesses. It's like Amazon. It's going to, you know, be made by X, Y, and Z company. It's going to come to Amazon. It's going to be stored and potentially confirmed, inspected that in fact it is what's been ordered, in fact it is what it says it is, and then ultimately moved on to the next licensee. So it'll send the products to a distributor. Again, this license sits in the middle of the product movement. The distributor will inspect the product before sending it by transport to the next stage. And it becomes really key. It becomes kind of a regulatory business type. It's this photo is a little bit exaggerated. It probably does not look like where the ARC is stored, but you get the idea. It's a warehouse. Okay. Any questions about distribution? Okay. Again, we would expect these probably in an industrial zone. Go ahead.
As far as distribution goes, because cannabis isn't federally legal, is distribution along federal highways allowable? So if I've got a facility in unincorporated part of near Lodi, and I want to transport my crops to a distribution facility in South County, can I do that on Highway 5?
Yes. So the way that the state structure works, certainly there is some federal funding for transport infrastructure, but so far we have never seen a state where it has been allowed, and keep in mind I believe there's 9 or more where it's allowed either in one form or another. And there has been no, to date, impact of federal funding being withheld for a transportation infrastructure. And in fact, the movement of cannabis is an issue. The fact that it is not legal on the federal level, that it remains a Schedule I drug, is an issue. And I think someone last night referred to it as the elephant in the room, and that is absolutely true, and absolutely is something that any operator, anybody who applies to be a cannabis business, they have to take and do a risk-benefit analysis for them, because they are operating in a world of Schedule I drugs as far as the feds are concerned. As far as the state is concerned, it is legal within the state framework, and transport is legal on state highways, roads. And in fact, the state law specifically addresses transport, and it's coming up in the distribution license type. The transport license type is next, but those two obviously interact, right? Is that the state has specifically addressed and said, locals, you cannot ban the transport of a licensed cannabis product or a licensed cannabis transporter through your jurisdiction. You don't have to allow a transport business to exist, or to and from a distributor, but you can't ban them coming through. So someone from Humboldt driving through to LA, we can't say you can't drive on county roads. It's been outlined in state law. As they legalized cannabis, that was how they saw the market being tied together. We have retained some local control, which was a key part, and certainly a key part for San Joaquin County, to say we deserve local control because we want to protect our citizens or be able to address the health and safety issue. But we can't say no to the transport, and so far the feds have not utilized that. Don't give them any ideas, though. All right, so now we get to transport, which we've already kind of touched bases on, but we're going to get more specific. All right, so licensed transporter, when you look back to that product movement, the little green blobs, that's what we're talking about. They're going to transport that cannabis between cannabis businesses, between license holders. So West Sac, for example, has a distribution facility. They have allowed distribution in this one location, but they have not allowed a transport business to be located in their jurisdiction. However, for the product to come to and from that facility, there has to be a licensed transport operator who takes that product to and from that facility. So maybe in Sacramento County, maybe in Sacramento City, maybe in Yolo. There will someday be a licensed transporter who will serve that distribution facility. So you can see that even though one community may say, this is the type of business that we want, there will still be interactions, and we've got some limits on that. That's going to be done only by a licensed transporter. Now, San Joaquin County has a ton of existing transport businesses. Because of our ag products, it is a very strong type of business here. We have a lot of history with it. We've got infrastructure for it. We specifically serve truck traffic along our freeways. It's a valued member of our business market. this is not your old school ag trucking. These are gonna have to utilize non-marked vehicles, and they're gonna have to transmit electronic shipping manifests to the state, as well as carry a copy. But again, it's an interesting question, right? Is this appropriate for our community? When in fact we do have a lot of transport, it's a thriving business type here already, but does the fact that it's cannabis change that question? Any questions on transport? That was a really interesting question about the federal roads, federal funding on roads. Any other questions on transport? You're itching for a discussion.
Yeah, on the group.
All right, you ready?
On the
Sure.
group.
Should I go now?
Sure, go ahead.
All right.
Quick question.
So, oh yeah, of course.
Are there any additional certification requirements for truck drivers or transportation drivers who are transporting that other than?
I have not seen any in the existing state law, but really good question. Will they have to be registered? Certainly they will have to work for a licensed transporter. And so would there be extra training? I haven't seen the specific regulations, but not at this time. So it is an interesting question about, you know, do I just show my ID for my licensed transport company? Or is there in fact special training? It's very analogous, or at least, okay, it's analogous, and it's very analogous to an armed guard driver. If there are heightened security concerns, and as a business owner, I am transporting something of a certain value, I as a business may want to provide additional security training. The question from our point of view, and what we're trying to get from you tonight, is are you saying, hey, if we allow transport, we think they should have extra video surveillance, or they should have extra training? And that's an interesting question about transport, because it isn't hauling a ton of grapes. It is a product that has an existing black market that we know will continue to exist for some time. So not yet, but maybe. All right, so as we frame the issue on our logistic license types, again, remembering where Stockton is, or where San Joaquin County is located, knowing that we do value our location for existing logistics, non-cannabis logistics, and thinking about our location to the Bay Area, to LA, to the northern counties. We, again, are asking the threshold question, should we permit these types of businesses in San Joaquin County? That's the big question. If we do permit manufacturing, testing, distribution, transportation, or one of those, or two of those, or three of those, then we come to the question, we always have the question of where, and then we have the added question of should we treat medical and adult use differently? Do we value that medical market in a way that we don't value the rec, or do we see rec as a ultimately more economically viable and long-term, and therefore we want to put our eggs in that basket? So this is the discussion, so let's go ahead and open it up on the logistic license types. Go ahead.
Coming back to my initial comment on the four items that you mentioned, manufacturing, testing, distribution, and transportation, each of them are going to require an individual license, as I understand it, from the state, and potentially also from the county in the event that the county adopts an ordinance authorizing this, so that there will be separate licenses. But this is an ideal example of addressing all security issues, all staffing issues, all enclosure issues, to have them in an enclosed facility as one in a business park. They all fit. You can have a large enough facility to do the manufacturing, you can separate it from the testing, and then the distribution and the transportation, and have the appropriate staff and the regulations to do it, as opposed to separating each one in different locales.
And in fact, we've seen that model in non-cannabis businesses, haven't we? We've seen it out in Tracy, we've seen it in Lodi for the wine industry, where we've got co-location of different facilities. And so what you're saying is the fact that it's cannabis, good business is good business, and minimizing sort of those community concerns, you can do that by co-locating these potentially, and you don't see a negative effect from these businesses, and in fact, you think that's a pretty good idea?
Yes.
Okay, I do want to address, you mentioned a local license and a state license, and we want to get more input than we give, but we also do want to make sure people understand that state structure has set up a dual license, so you're exactly right. There has to be a local approval, and that's a generic term in state law. We just have to, as a local, would have to, or may, say, you are approved to operate this type of business where you are operating this type of business in our jurisdiction. that operator takes that local approval, whether that's a CUP, whether that's, you know, an ordinance that says I can operate in this area, and in fact my parcel is in this area, they take that to state regulators, and ultimately that's how they get their state license. So you're totally right, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Go ahead.
I absolutely believe that the county should allow manufacturing, testing, distribution, and transportation. If you look, I think you touched on it, on our location within the state with respect to other more heavily impacted areas of the cannabis industry. The Emerald Triangle area to our north coast, Calaveras County to our east, the Bay Area. These are all heavily impacted with indoor and outdoor cultivators and other manufacturers. We sit between those locations and the Los Angeles area that has 400 to 500 licensed dispensaries. And given our location in the state, we could serve as a logistics hub, given that we have the available transportation infrastructure. Where should they be located within our county? I think they should definitely be kept out of the commercial zones. They should be limited to the agricultural and the industrial zones. As long as the individual businesses can meet the objective criteria that was set as far as the regulatory standards are concerned, security, having common sense and reasonable logistics standards.
Wait, common sense? That is not common. I'm not sure we can regulate common sense.
Common sense, common sense as far as what you're trying to accomplish.
Got it.
I think as long as they're all held to the same set of objective standards, that they should be allowed to have the opportunity to conduct business.
Does anybody think that there's a negative impact from having these, they're cannabis operators, so they may be targets for the black market? Is there security issues or other issues that we see from allowing these types of cannabis businesses?
None that can't be addressed.
I agree.
Okay, so address it through regulation, look at health and safety. We know that reasonable regulation has worked Stockton, other places. That's kind of what I'm hearing.
Yes.
Okay. Any thoughts?
The only thought that I have is you talked about manufacturing, testing, distribution, transportation being a good business model. Is it something the county would want to mandate in order to keep those functions of the cannabis industry together? Would the county want to mandate that the manufacturing, testing, distribution, and transportation has to be within one specific area? In other words, you can't.
Oh, I see. Create that space.
Yeah, exactly, like an industrial park, like you said. Is that something the county would want to mandate instead of just leaving it up to private sector? I don't know, it's just a thought.
Interesting. So we're definitely going to take that note down. That's not something that's been considered. That's not something we generally do, but cannabis is a whole new world, so everything's on the table. So interesting thought. Again, outside the box, that's why we're opening it up. It's a really interesting question. Since Howard said there may be a synergy there, a way to meet community considerations, that may be something we want to consider. Interesting question or comment. Any other comments? All right. So now we are moving on to personal cannabis cultivation. I really appreciate the meaningful input, and I really would love to see those comments also provided on the website. Bring your friends, family. Let's have more people in these seats than we have team members. So Mark's going to do the personal cannabis cultivation portion of the program, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Zoe. So we spoke about and got your ideas, your comments, and your thoughts on this topic of commercial cannabis. I want to talk about at your home. I want to talk about in your neighborhood. Not at the store on the corner, not over by the AM/PM, not over by the CVS, but actually in your neighborhood and how it plays out there. So as we said, under the state law as it exists now, you can grow 6 plants. And what we're interested in is what are the concerns that individuals have about, hey, my neighbor's growing 6 plants, how is that going to affect me? Because I'll tell you how it's going to affect the county is that come time to harvest in September or October, the phone lines over at community development and code enforcement are going to burn up because everybody's calling because, you know, my neighbor's plants stink and it's affecting my enjoyment of my backyard. or they're gonna burn up the lines to the sheriff's department with the same complaints. And so our concern is this. State law says you can cultivate up to 6 plants inside a private residence or inside an accessory structure to a private residence that's fully enclosed and secure. Private residence means house, apartment unit, mobile home, or other similar dwelling cannot be visible from a public place. We cannot ban the personal cultivation if it falls within, if it's indoor. We can allow it to be outdoor. We can restrict the total square footage of the grow. We can restrict the location in the home. And of course, they're going to be subject to regular building code and safety requirements. So I don't have multiple slides on this. This is pretty much it. Same concerns. One of the big ones for us here is this idea of a multifamily residential unit. Is there a difference between growing in my single family residence or if I live in an apartment building? Thoughts?
What's the difference between that and smoking cigarettes? There are regulations in place throughout many areas where you can't smoke cigarettes within certain areas in multi-residential facilities. So how do you compare those two issues?
Well, exactly. But I think that's the information that we need to take back to the board is that, is the public concerned with that? Or is the public not concerned with the impacts that can be imposed, especially in a multifamily residential setting?
Doesn't the state really preempt on this? I mean, is there anything that locally individuals or the county or cities can do to undermine or undercut what you've already indicated with 6 plants in a home or in an apartment? Isn't that preempted by the state?
I don't think it is. I think when it says that we can reasonably regulate, and when we get to a discussion of multifamily residential units where you have airflow that is not isolated to an individual unit, I think that is an area where we can regulate.
Well,
that may,
exactly.
and we may want to take the lead on it and fight that fight.
But some of the issues are, remember, we went back and we said reasonable regulation is something that affects the health and safety. So if there is a nexus with health and safety, the same way they did with smoking, it's about limiting that. We also see some issues with, families, do we need to limit it with mold? So some of those are the areas of reasonable regulation.
So,
I think as far as odor control in multifamily residential units, possibly one way to address that would be to have some supplemental air filtration system located within the home. Certainly not an industrial carbon filter like you'd have in a commercial cannabis operation, but something to address air filtration so that your neighbors, your flatmates are not adversely affected by that.
okay.
Just a thought.
Are there questions about personal cultivation? No question about personal cultivation. So then the question is, would you like the county to consider establishing reasonable regulations around personal cannabis cultivation undertaken by you or your neighbors? So that really brings it down to the very personal level. Do you want the county regulating what you do in your home with regard to cannabis cultivation?
Frankly, hell no. If you're entitled to have 6 plants in a single family home or in the garage adjacent to or next to that single family home, and that has been enacted by the state, that's it. You're entitled to it. And a lot of us just have to live with it.
Well, one of the considerations is, that's been brought up is, well, if you put if you restrict it to indoor grows, then there is an energy cost that goes along with that on a large scale impacts the state. So is it better to have outdoor cultivation? Playing the devil's advocate.
Shouldn't that be the choice of the property owner or the individual? And so far as the energy bill is concerned, it'll show up in your PG&E bill.
Well, I'm not talking about, certainly on an individual basis, there's a decision about do I want to grow or not, and do I want the electrical bill that goes along with that. But if you take, 5 million people and they're growing indoors and they've got sodium lights going and the power draw for that, there's a cost to the environment from the additional draw on electricity. So on that regard, is it better to say, no, grow it outdoor? The flip side of that is, if we say grow it outdoor, are we increasing the chance that you're impacting your neighbors?
To what extent are we our brother's keeper? How far are you going to go?
Well, that's exactly the question, is because the board has the opportunity to impose reasonable regulation here. And so we need to have the feedback from the public.
I think in addition, when you talk about, because you can restrict just to outdoor, just to indoor, or both, am I correct by understanding that?
Yes.
The county can.
Yes, the county can allow it outdoor, we cannot prohibit it indoor.
Oh, okay.
So the state law says,
so-
yes, you can have an indoor. The county can be more lax and say you can also grow outdoor.
Okay, got it. Never mind.
But we can reasonably regulate that indoor.
Any other comments on personal cultivation?
I don't think Howard told us how he really feels.
To me, it's a non-issue. It really is.
Why do you say that?
Because the bulk of people, if they have that choice of being regulated outdoors and not being regulated indoors, and they have the garage or the home space, that's what they're going to do.
Okay. One of the other points that's been brought up in one of the previous meetings was if you allow retail or dispensary, then you will cut down on the number of people who feel the need to grow within their own homes and thereby impose those externalities on their neighbors. Maybe. Or at least at some point. Everybody, those who are so inclined will at least start to, but if you're like me, you'll kill all 6 plants and then you'll just, go down to the store anyhow.
Just a thought I just had when I think about outdoor growing. When I was a kid and I wanted that apple that was in my neighbor's yard next door, it would mean nothing to me to hop the fence and grab that apple. And I wonder to what extent we'd be encouraging that if we allow outdoor grows throughout the neighborhoods, throughout the county. Just a thought.
That's a very good thought. Thank you. Zach?
I think one way to address the public safety threat, if the county were to allow personal cultivation outdoors, would be requiring that individual to have some type of surveillance camera covering their outdoor grow. The potential burglar who jumps the fence, even if they're going just to pull, one plant out of the ground, they're still committing a felony. And if, you're requiring surveillance coverage on that garden, I think, when you're starting to bust people for doing that and they're subject to prison time, given the low cost and the convenient access to cannabis at retail facilities, if the county chose to go that way, I think the threat of imprisonment would be sufficient deterrent effect, and a way to bolster that would be requiring some type of surveillance coverage.
Okay. Any other thoughts? There are comment cards if you have additional comments that we haven't been able to capture. There's a box in the back, or you can leave them on the seat. Or if you just want to talk to us as we clean up, then we're certainly open to that as well. The chocolate chip cookies are in the back. There's bottles of water back there also. We have a website, sjccannabis.org. There's a survey there. We'd like you to go there, fill out the survey, provide us information. We are trying as hard as we can to get as much information as we can get so that we can provide it to the board so that they can consider all of it when they give us policy direction.
Mark,
I just have one general question. In the event that the county says, we're not gonna change from what we presently have, is there any potential adverse impact imposed by the state once their regulations are in place?
So the adverse impact that exists should the county prohibit commercial cannabis businesses is, and it exists in Proposition 64. There is a, for lack of a better term, there's a waterfall of tax revenue. And as the tax revenue comes in, the first level reimburses the state for their expenses. And we think that that's something in the neighborhood of $250 million to fill that bucket. And then it falls over into the next bucket, and the next bucket are the feel-good programs, the kids programs, the after-school programs, the education programs. And when that bucket fills up, then it falls down to a third bucket, and within that third bucket it breaks out into 3 categories. One category of that is grants, they're criminal justice grants that communities can apply for. And if you have a ban on cultivation and commercial cannabis businesses, you're not eligible to apply for those grants. So that's the existing downside, for statutory downside.
Thanks.
Any other questions? That's it for this evening. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you, everyone. This was really good
Sorry.
input.